long before the United States existed as a nation, before European explorers ever glimpsed the Pacific coast, the fertile valley of the Stillaguamish River in what we now call Washington State was home to thriving indigenous communities. The Stillaguamish people, whose name means river people, had lived in this region for thousands of years, developing sophisticated cultures centered around the abundant salmon runs, vast cedar forests, and rich prairies. Few established trails existed, so canoe travel was the primary mode of transportation. On July 4th, 1776, 3,000 miles away across an uncharted continent, 13 colonies united in Philadelphia to adopt the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming that all men are created equal, and establishing the revolutionary principle that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. While the Revolutionary War raged from Massachusetts to the Carolinas, with George Washington leading Continental forces against British armies, the Stillaguamish Valley remained a world unto itself. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest continued their ancient way of life, undisturbed, maintaining complex trade networks stretching from California to Alaska with seasonal villages that maximized the region's natural resources. This was a functioning civilization that understood the rhythms and beauty of the Pacific Northwest. While the newly formed United States was establishing its government under the Constitution in 1789, the Pacific Northwest remained largely unknown to Americans. The great expeditions of Lewis and Clark, commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson in 1803, would reach the Columbia River in 1805, giving the United States a claim to the Oregon Territory that included Washington. However, the Stillaguamish Valley remained beyond their northern route. Instead, it was maritime explorers, Spanish, British, and eventually American, who first brought European influence to Puget Sound. Captain George Vancouver's 1792 expedition explored Puget Sound and took formal possession of the Pacific Northwest for Great Britain on the shores of what is now Everett. Though Vancouver didn't specifically explore the Stillaguamish River, his charts put this region on the maps of the Western world for the first time. Meanwhile, the young United States was grappling with fundamental questions of expansion, slavery, and federal power that would define the nation's character. In the 1840s, the Oregon Trail began carrying thousands of American settlers westward, and the cry of 5440 or fight reflected American determination to claim the entire Pacific Northwest up to Alaska. The 1846 treaty between the United States and Britain established the U.S.-Canadian boundary at 49 degrees north latitude, placing the Stillaguamish Valley firmly within American territorial claims. On August 14, 1848, Oregon Territory was formed and included today's states of Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and the western parts of Montana and Wyoming. That same year, gold was discovered in California, creating great expeditions toward the West Coast. The California Gold Rush of 1849 transformed the entire West Coast. While most attention focused on California, the economic ripple effects reached north to Puget Sound. Lumber from the vast, ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest became essential for California's booming construction. The Stillaguamish Valley, with its mammoth, towering Douglas firs and red cedars, was positioned to become part of this lumber empire. The 1850s brought the first significant wave of American settlement to Puget Sound and exploration of the Stillaguamish Valley. Explorers Samuel Hancock and George O. Wilson were canoed up the Stillaguamish River by Indian guides, seeking gold, silver, and other riches. Based upon their description of finding coal, it was thought they traveled up to Jordan on the South Fork of the Stillaguamish. The Donation Land Claim Act of 1850 offered free land to settlers willing to develop it, though this generous offer to Americans did not involve Native American peoples in the decision. On March 2, 1853, Washington Territory was formed and included part of Idaho. Isaac Ingalls Stevens became the first territorial governor, a man who would later serve as a United States congressman and die as a brigadier general in the Union Army at the Battle of Chantilly during the American Civil War. The Treaty of Point Elliott, signed in 1855, was supposed to establish reservations and protect Native American rights while opening most of the region to American settlement. The Stillaguamish people found their traditional territories drastically reduced and their way of life under increasing pressure. During this same period, America was becoming increasingly divided over slavery. While Washington Territory was officially free territory, the national tensions that would lead to the Civil War were building. The Stillaguamish Valley, though thousands of miles from the main conflict, would not remain untouched by America's defining struggle. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Washington Territory seemed far removed from the conflict between North and South. That same year, Snohomish County was established, and a rough census was taken that enumerated 49 non-native men and no women. Early male settlers sometimes created families with native women. However, the war's effects reached even the Stillaguamish Valley. California's loyalty to the Union was crucial, and maintaining communication and supply lines to the Pacific coast became an important strategy for the Union. On May 20th, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act.
Most of the early settlers came here because at that time you could get a 160-acre claim if you worked on it 5 years and proved up, and part of it was to plant an orchard, clear some land, make some improvements, and that was kind of monitored by a government agency, and in this case it ended up being mostly the editor of the paper in Arlington, Cal Marsh.
The first permanent American settlers trickled into the Stillaguamish Valley during the 1860s and 1870s, with the main influx beginning in the 1880s. Explorers and later settlers started at Stanwood and moved up the river to Arlington at the Forks, where the Stillaguamish River's North Fork and South Fork join. These pioneers were drawn by the same forces that drove westward expansion throughout American history: free land, natural resources, and the chance to build something new. During this period, the Stillaguamish River was the transportation highway of the time. Indians were hired to transport people and goods up and down the river in canoes, pushed along using long poles. In the dense forest, thick underbrush grew, making walking along the riverbank difficult. The Indian canoe freighters charged from $10 to $20 per canoe load from Stanwood to Arlington. Two canoes would be lashed together side by side to haul heavy, bulky loads. Several massive log jams in the river made canoe travel especially difficult. These jams were composed of trees, logs, and debris, driven together into an almost solid mass, sometimes nearly half a mile long and as much as 15 and 20 feet deep. Over these jams had to be hauled and carried canoes, boats, and supplies. Pioneers struggled to live in the wilderness. Every day was a hardship to have enough food and a warm, dry shelter. These settlers faced the typical challenges of frontier life: clearing dense forest, building homes and barns, establishing basic transportation routes, and creating the social institutions of civilization. Unlike settlers on the Great Plains, those in the Stillaguamish Valley had to contend with massive trees, steep terrain, snow, and heavy rainfall. The river, which was the settlers' lifeline to the outside world, experienced recurring floods that damaged or destroyed crops, livestock, barns, and homes, and sometimes destroyed lives. Between Florence and the Pilchuck Creek, some of these settlers brought their wives up the river on the first trip. Others first built a cabin and brought wives and families later. It is worthy of mention that a few of those who didn't, namely the bachelors, didn't stay long. Somehow or other they got dissatisfied and either pulled out or committed suicide. There were a few exceptions, and even some of these became kind of funny. Therefore, we might come to the conclusion that women folks were a necessary element, even in the wilderness, said Nels Bruseth in 1916. In 1877, considered the first settler in the Arlington area, J.L. Frank Kent settled on 160 acres at the southwest corner of Highland Drive and Stillaguamish Avenue. on land that included what was described as a cranberry bog near today's Kent Prairie Elementary School. For centuries, the Indians foraged for food on the prairie, picking berries and digging up camas roots, which were similar to potatoes. In 1877, Sievert Breckus imported a cow from Stanwood to his farm, 5 miles west of Arlington. The following year, 1878, Toby Gardner, an Indian, brought the first cow in a canoe from Stanwood to the Forks at Arlington. The cow was hog-tied with its legs bound together and its head covered to help calm the frightened animal. In 1880, the land lying immediately west of Arlington at Island Crossing, comprising about 16 square miles, was taken up mostly by men of German descent, headed by Thomas Jensen, who settled there in 1880. At the flood of the Stillaguamish River in 1880, some of the settlers got scared and moved away, one of them saying he would rather drown on the sea than on land. During the 1880s, pioneers like Hans Thompson and his wife worked their modest homesteads with yokes of oxen pulling sleds with heavy tree slabs. Oxen were stronger and more powerful than horses, dragging enormous logs cut from fallen trees to be cut into lumber. A heavy wooden yoke was placed over their shoulders. Rings were inserted through their tender noses so they were more obedient when being led. Loggers often cruelly treated oxen by jabbing their hides with sharp pointed rods to force the animals to work long and hard hours. When they got old and played out or got into an accident, they were not retired on a pension. The camp butcher got them, and when finally killed, they were used for food. In May 1883, Matthew Macaulay, a Civil War veteran, took up the first claim on the South Fork of the Stillaguamish River. Also in 1883, Kurt J. Murphy took up a claim 1/2 mile west of Arlington. Mr. Murphy has proven to be one of our most valuable pioneers. He was county assessor and census taker in 1886. The pioneers of Kent Prairie knew it was important for their children to go to school. Before a school could be built, first, a school district had to be formed. The people of Kent Prairie made 2 requests to form a school district in 1882 and 1883. Both requests were denied. In April 1884, C.J. Murphy made a 7-day round-trip journey on foot, canoe, and steamship to the county school superintendent's office in Snohomish, asking to form a school district. On May 16, 1884, the school district was approved, and school district number 16 was formed, originally a vast area of over 600 square miles. On July 4, 1884, Arlington held its first 4th of July celebration on Frank Kent's Place, an expression of deep patriotism and love of country, even though Washington was still a territory. Statehood would not come for another 5 years. His homestead was at the southwest corner of Highland Drive and Stillaguamish Avenue. The North Fork was settled mostly by people from the Middle West. On March 1, 1884, Mr. and Mrs. R. Collingwood pitched their tent on the North Fork. Next morning, there was 4 inches of snow. Mrs. Collingwood was the first white woman to settle on the North Fork. The North Fork was called Starved Out Valley because of the perilous hardships of trying to survive there and having enough to eat. In 1885, a rough wagon road was built from Snohomish-Pilchuck to Kent's Prairie. Thus, on Kent's Prairie, civilization was fully established in the year 1885, especially with Arlington getting a school the next year in 1886. Between 1881 and 1885, Bernhard Ben Schloman, accompanied by his mother, took up 162 acres on the north side of the river just below the Forks. On November 1st, 1887, he opened a post office on this homestead known as Schloman Post Office and was postmaster for 2 years. About once a week, mail was delivered from Sylvana in a canoe by Sivert Engeseth, a reminder of how isolated and challenging communication was in those early days. The Schlomans worked to form the Free Methodist Church in Arlington, bringing spiritual community to the frontier settlement. On May 1st, 1885, the Postal Telegraph and Cable Company built a telegraph office known as the Walker Station Telegraph Office south of Island Crossing. The lines for the telegraph cables were strung from San Francisco, California to a hub at Seattle. A pathway was slashed through the thick forest to the Hans Thompson homestead. Morse code was used to send and receive messages. Forest fires and fallen trees sometimes disrupted the vital communication link to the outside world. Arlington's first school was taught in the home of Ned Lewis at Kent Prairie. In June 1885, John Condit was hired to teach a 3-month term for $45 a month. 2 white children and 12 Indian children attended. Ned Lewis, a white man, lived with his Indian wife and 5 children on Kent Prairie, an exceptionally beautiful place in the valley. Mrs. Lewis, being native to the land, knew much about the Stillaguamish Valley and ways to survive in the harsh wilderness. On February 2nd, 1886, J.L. Frank Kent leased 1 acre to School District Number 16 for $1 a year over a 10-year period, and Arlington's first schoolhouse was built in the early spring 2 blocks north of Kent Prairie Elementary School. The one-room school was roughly 16 by 20 feet, 320 square feet, and cost $198. The flooring was milled on Camano Island at Utsalati and was brought up by Indians in a canoe and then dragged by a span of mules to the schoolhouse. Winnie Preston attended Kent Prairie School and remembered it was built during the winter of 1885-1886, being constructed entirely of split cedar, including the roof, 4 walls, door, school seats, and desks. However, no school had more animated or lovely students or more beautiful surroundings of tall evergreen trees, tall waving ferns, wildflowers along the creek in abundance, berries on the vine and bushes, fish in the running water, birds on the prairie, where they always sing so sweetly, a child's grave under nearby trees, all this with a background of tall snow-covered mountains. Between 1886 through 1888, Bryant was settled, mostly by Scandinavians, led by Jens J. Hjort, a man of considerable education. In 1887, before the railroad's arrival, many settlers traveled to the Stillaguamish Valley by wagon train in a covered wagon, often pulled by oxen. In 1887, Walter D. Higgins homesteaded a claim at Hazel under the shadow of the great mountain that bears his name, Mount Higgins. He and his daughter, Linnie E. Higgins, at age 16, traveled by covered wagon from Texas through Arlington to Hazel. In 1888, the Cascade Tunnel on the Northern Pacific Railroad was completed, giving Puget Sound a direct continental railroad. The Jim Creek Valley was settled about 1888 by Jackson Person, Bert Porter, and many more of our prominent pioneers. Here's an organ that was brought up the Stillaguamish River by canoe and is now on display at the Stillaguamish Valley Museum. In April 1888, Captain Gore navigated the Gleaner, a small steamboat, up the Stillaguamish River in swollen water, half a mile past the Forks to Gifford's Landing at the bend in the river at Lincoln Bridge, near today's Gilman Walk community. The Gleaner delivered building supplies and merchandise to a store being built by Nels K. Tweet and Nils C. Johnson. Most importantly, the Gleaner delivered Mr. Johnson's new bride. Due to shallow places in the river, the steamboat had a hard time navigating the water. This was the last time a steamboat ventured up the river to Arlington. Tweet and Johnson's store, a log cabin, opened a month later in May 1888. It was the first store built in the Arlington area and became the trading center for the Upper Valley. Here the government established a post office in the store with E.O. Anderson as mail carrier to and from Stanwood. White House Hotel was Arlington's first hotel and was built at the Forks by Lee Rogers, a Civil War veteran, and Al Densmore in the fall of 1889. Densmore had a logging operation behind the hotel on the north side of the river. In 1889, Aaron L. Blair, called the stepfather of Haller City, was the first to use the new road from Stanwood to the Forks, driving a yoke of oxen, and soon established a regular transportation service. At Haller, he built and opened a feed store that sold feed and hay. Around 1889, while taking an Indian canoe up the Stillaguamish River to their land claim on the burn, Parr L. Wallace and his wife Janet Ferguson Wallace stopped and stayed the night with Ben Schloman, who lived west of the Forks on the north side of the Stillaguamish River. Mr. Schloman cooked a delicious supper the main ingredient of which was a generous roast. He asked his guests to guess as to the kind of meat comprising the roast. Mrs. Wallace suggested beaver, and this proved to be correct. Tradition says it was a very tender and delicious roast. The year 1890 would prove to be transformative for the Stillaguamish Valley. Arlington and Haller City bitterly competed for the Seattle, Lakeshore, and Eastern Railroad to build a train depot in their town. On March 15, 1890, the 9th block plat of the town of Arlington, located south of 3rd Street between Olympic and French, was filed by railroad contractors Earl and McLeod. Two different stories suggest how Arlington got its name. One story says that Earl and McLeod named the area after Lord Henry Arlington of the notorious Cabal Cabinet of King Charles II of England, dating back to 1667. Another story says the town's name came from Arlington National Cemetery in Arlington, Virginia. About a month later, the 50th block plat of Haller City at the Forks was filed on April 24, 1890. Haller City was from Haller Park to the Lincoln Bridge between the river and Division Street. Sadly, Maurice Haller, who dreamed of building a frontier town at Haller City, drowned in a boating accident on Puget Sound in December 1889. His brother, Theodore, and two companions completed his project and named it Haller City. The town of Arlington was platted first, but only because of Maurice Haller's tragic death. On June 13, 1890, the first construction train, the train that built the railroad, arrived in Arlington, operated by the Seattle, Lakeshore, and Eastern Railroad. July 23rd saw the first freight train arrive in Arlington, followed by steady service of freight and passenger trains. In October 1890, a train depot was built in Arlington, a substantial loss for Haller City.
Because that kind of decided where the town would grow. And you couldn't very well have a railroad depot down by the river because the tracks were, 15 feet up in the air. So they decided to have the railroad depot where it was finally located. There's a replica of it there now in the 200 block in Arlington.
The railroad's arrival in downtown Arlington brought prosperity and jobs throughout the area, benefiting merchants, farmers, and many other people. Most significantly, the railroad enabled an explosion of the logging industry, bringing in heavy logging equipment and benefiting timber barons, mill owners, loggers, and mill workers. A new wave of settlers would come on trains powered by steam. Railroad tracks were laid into Arlington, and the area rapidly transformed from the wilderness to civilization. Mills and camps were established on the railroad, population and wealth increased rapidly. Roads were opened, schoolhouses were built in every settlement, and where there were no churches, religious worship was held in the schoolhouses. At Haller, in 1891, the Seattle, Lakeshore, and Eastern Railway had a drawbridge built over the main channel of the Stillaguamish River, just downstream from the Forks. In December 1890, just before the new year, the bridge company swung the bridge open as a demonstration that it worked, then turned the bridge over to the railroad. This was the first and last time the bridge was opened. The bridge began operation in 1891. Federal authorities required a drawbridge because the Stillaguamish had been declared a navigable stream. This was because a small steamboat, the Gleaner, had ascended the river from Stanwood to a point half a mile above the Forks at Gifford's Landing. The tall tower in the center of the bridge was used to open the drawbridge. The house on the left approach was the bridge tender's home and was occupied by John Conderman and his family. The animosity between Haller City and the town of Arlington was so bitter and intense that the school superintendent allowed each little town to build their own schoolhouse. On June 6, 1891, School District Number 50 was formed out of Arlington School District to form a new district for Haller. Despite the rivalry amongst people in Haller City and Arlington, the Twin City baseball team in 1891 showed that these communities could come together. These baseball players joined together to play ball. When the Great Northern Railway was completed to Seattle in 1893, it fundamentally changed the character of the Stillaguamish Valley. What had been an isolated logging and agricultural community suddenly became a vital link in a transcontinental transportation network. On July 29, 1899, a tragedy struck in downtown Arlington at the Arlington Lumber Company. The shingle department, mill office, Gifford's residence, boarding house, and Kranzhoff's and Kennedy's blacksmith shops were destroyed in a fire. The townspeople quickly formed a bucket brigade to prevent the raging fire from destroying the entire downtown. Tragically, the night watchman was burned to death in the fire. The lumber industry in the Arlington area was characterized by massive operations that could clear entire hillsides in a matter of months. Companies like the Stillaguamish Timber Company operated extensive logging railroads that deep into the mountains, bringing out enormous logs that were then processed in local mills or shipped to larger facilities in Seattle and Everett. The work was dangerous.
You had cables and oxen pulling, and then in 1900, the mill's machinery was able to come into Arlington. They had 6 shingle mills down there. There was a big sawmill down there. There was a sawmill in town itself, and those mills had a terrific demand for logs. It's dangerous cutting down huge trees in the woods, limbs falling off, breaking off as the tree starts to fall. Even though the logger is sawing and gets away from the tree, sometimes limbs came down and killed them, or logs rolled on them when they were sawing them off. It was a weekly occurrence almost of some fatal injuries. The only recourse was to send them down to Arlington on the train. Well, if the train had some logger injured on it, as it hit the switch onto the main line down by the river, they'd start blowing the whistle on the train until they stopped behind Mrs. Teeger's store, because she was like an emergency section, I suppose, in a modern-day hospital. But she had them bring them in to her kitchen table, and it was there that she did amputate arms and legs. Some of them made it, and some didn't due to loss of blood and shock. But she was a very held in very high esteem, a very humble woman.
It was inevitable that the two towns should merge, but the ownership of a 40-acre tract lying between Holler City and Arlington was disputed. In 1894, ownership was resolved in favor of Thomas McMahon, opening the way for the merger of the Twin Cities. In 1903, an election was held on May 5th, and the two towns incorporated on May 20th as Arlington. James Smith became the first mayor. The incorporated town of Arlington was about to have several notable triumphs. Arlington's first town hall was constructed in 1904. It was located at the southeast corner of McLeod and 3rd Street and served as the council chamber, fire station, and jail, sometimes called the Cooler. A 40-foot bell tower was erected in 1906. The bell has been preserved and may be seen at the Stillaguamish Valley Museum. In 1903, John A. Gray rented the hardware store built in 1890 by Thomas Moran. Mr. Gray bought the store in 1907. This was the beginning of Arlington Hardware and Lumber Company that operates today, a business with roots stretching back over 130 years. In 1905, the Jim Creek Dam, located 7 miles east, started to produce electricity for Arlington and later supplied water.
First dam kind of washed out. It wasn't put in good enough. And so then they put the second one in. That was a terrific expense. But they did get electricity to Arlington in the latter part of 1906.
The dam was rebuilt with concrete and steel reinforcements to a height of 63 feet. In November 1906, when power was restored, the dam was briefly the highest hydroelectric plant in the world. Due to ongoing problems, the dam stopped operating in 1928. By 1910, the Stillaguamish Valley had undergone a remarkable transformation. In just one generation, a wilderness that had been home to the Stillaguamish people for generations had become a thriving American community, connected to the nation by steel rails and bound together by schools, churches, hospitals, and a shared determination to build something lasting. Today, the Stillaguamish Valley Museum preserves this remarkable history, with over 10,000 artifacts and more than 4,000 historical photographs kept in memory of the pioneers who came before us. Displays throughout the museum and grounds provide insights into the lives of early settlers of the valley, while a research library of books and records documents our local history. We invite you to visit and discover the stories of those who shaped this valley into the community we know today.